Military vehicles operate in a lot of really dirty and grimy situations, and if you've looked through photo references of deployed vehicles, they get extremely muddy. The crew also walks on the vehicle, adding mud and dust to the upper surfaces of the vehicle. When building a model tank kit, to really up the realism of your final product, mud and dust effects are a super effective way to do so. Today we'll be going through the entire mud and dust application on the T14 Armata, using speckling, dry brushing, streaking, and more to achieve a super realistic result. Without further ado, I am the scale engineer. Let's begin. Let's start by base coating the wheels and the tracks. I base coated the tracks in dark gray to begin with, making sure to get the paint into all the crevices of each track. Then I added a little medium blue and painted the rubbers of the road wheels. This will give a little bit of distinction between the gray of the tracks and the gray of the road wheels. Then I used a paint mask included in the Voyager photo etch set to perfectly paint the wheels with a slightly lighter version of the base coat. To finish it off and provide a more robust base for weathering, I hit everything with a coat of VMS satin varnish. For the steel idlers, I painted the contact surfaces silver, along with anywhere that the drive sprocket would contact the tracks. Next up, let's weather the wheels. Generally for mud effects, I like working light to dark, where the dust effects are the most prevalent and cover the most area, and each subsequent layer covers less and less of the total surface area. This leads to the most realistic effect in my experience. For the dust, I'm using AK Light Dust Deposits as it has a really fine texture and dries completely flat. This helps add to the overall textural interest of the model and looks the most realistic. As you can see, we're going to apply it basically over the entire wheel and then blend out any tide marks with odorless mineral spirits. I'll also remove it off of any high points that I find that it's too concentrated on, just to make it a little bit more dynamic. Also, as a side note, I have no idea why my camera decided to focus there, but you get the main point. For the main mud effects, I'm going to be mixing up a combination of AK Heavy Mud turned earth, plaster of Paris, and a bit of sifted dirt. This is going to give us a wide variety of textures to play with and really help build up the accumulated mud look. If I was redoing this, I would have added a bit more plaster of Paris since it helps add more body to the paint and binds the dirt and the paint together better. In some ways, you can see that the mix I used here is a little rockier than I think is 100% accurate. This was applied to the wheels a little more sparingly than the dust effects and blended out with mineral spirits. The main thing I try to do with this part is to make sure that the dirt lays down on the surface realistically, because if you're not careful, it can clump up too much and look unrealistic. I'm also going to add a little bit more paint on top of some of the more exposed rocks after blending, since I didn't add enough paint to begin with. This is the issue I was talking about, where I wanted to add more plaster of Paris than I ended up doing. Finally, I added some speckling effects by flicking a loaded paintbrush at the wheels and blended that out a little bit. This will help add some randomness and variation to the surface that helps complete the look. As you can see, I'm going to remove only a little bit of the speckles to leave some on there and increase the randomness of the surface, but I want to take away a couple of them so that they don't overpower the previous effects that we've already done. Now, in forested, grassy environments like Ukraine, a ton of grass can be caught up in the running gear, especially around the drive sprockets in the rear of the vehicle. Hindsight being 2020, I should have added some on the road wheels, but I don't think it's too critical. To achieve this effect, we're going to use some static grass and matte medium to hold it down. As you can see, I added this matte varnish to everywhere that I wanted the static grass to stay. Then I put some of my static grass into an old kit box, since this stuff legitimately gets everywhere, and tossed it onto the drive sprocket. Tossing the static grass instead of taking a clump and applying it with your fingers adds a lot of randomness to the placement of the grass, and I think overall it looks better. We can then add or remove tufts that we don't like depending on your own preferences. Now, I am not very good at mud and dust effects for tracks, and the very flat profile of these tracks makes it pretty difficult to add any built-up mud deposits, and so we're going to mostly use speckling effects to add visual interest to the tracks. Something like a tiger tank, which has a much deeper cavity and cleat, really allows for some really cool effects with built-up mud, but something shallow like this, it just doesn't have the space for it. We're going to use an initial light brown wash of burnt umber oils for a rusty appearance, and then follow it up with a ton of light and dark brown speckling for mud and dust effects. Since that looks pretty messy, I'm going to follow that with some basic blending on the rubber track pads to hopefully give it a smoother appearance. The only thing I'm not super happy about is that the oils interacted with the dust effects and left rusty stains in the dust. Next time we do a tracked vehicle, I'm going to either apply the oils along with the general hull of the vehicle or use acrylics for the rust effects. I'm also going to use a slightly lighter color for the base track color next time. For the flat side of the tracks, I'm going to use an angular shader to more generally blend the effects together. You can really see the rust come through on this, and I'm not 100% happy with it. We can then use a graphite pencil to add a metallic sheen to the places where the running gear is going to contact the tracks, as these places will be continuously polished by the running gear. Before we button up the running gear and side skirts, let's finish up the lower hull, otherwise it'll be really hard to access. I wanted to try something a little different with the caked on mud effects for this project, and to establish a nice base for the general mud effects, I used this crackle paste from Golden. It's water soluble and has a really nice texture. It also cracks as it dries, leaving a super neat effect that looks like mud that's dried out. Application is super simple. We'll just glob it on. It has a really neat texture, really light, almost foamy, and it packs down nicely when you blend some water onto it with a brush. I just placed this anywhere that would be easily visible and would also have a bunch of mud thrown up onto it, like the areas around the idler and drive sprockets, front and rear plates, and on the entrenchment blades on the front. Next, I'm going to spray the crackle paste with Tamiya Flat Earth to get the base coat more in line with what we're shooting for in the final product. The flat earth is a bit too saturated for my liking, but I'll be covering it with dust and mud effects, and so the flat earth functions well enough as a good base color to start with. Then, we're going to use the same dark mud mix from the road wheels to vary the tone and texture of the mud on the blades. For every layer, I'm really careful to blend it well because as mud dries, it generally dries in a gradient of shades instead of a harsh transition between dark and light mud. And so having these harsh transitions on your model, on your mud effects, is going to make it really ineffective in terms of convincing the viewer that it's realistic. After that, we'll speckle some dark and dust tones to add more variation in texture. Then we'll blend the dots of the enamel into the total mud effects and try to streak the dust a little bit too. I like to vary how much dust is blended over different surfaces, as dust should accumulate near edges and details, and so I bias the dust tones nearer to these vertical ribs that you can see in the front plate. Now, as you can see, I did speed up the blending process quite a bit because it takes a very long time to get this blended properly. But as you're doing it on your model, make sure to be patient and keep working the effects until you like what you have. Enamel paints dry really nicely and slowly, especially when you're using a good thinner, and so you can keep wetting that brush and keep working it for a long time. After that, I still felt like the tones weren't quite dark enough to imply damp or wet mud, so I added some AK dark mud. This effect was more like a wash and has no real texture to it, but with some careful blending it really integrates well into the other mud tones. In my experience, this product is really easy to mess up. It can lead to some sharp and tonal transitions between light and dark regions if not blended properly. That said, make sure to add this dark mud wash either on wet or firm mud effects so that the blending is smooth and realistic. I like to add this on any sections of heavier layers of mud that would take a bit longer to dry. I also added this in recessed areas or sharp corners where the water would pool and collect. We'll then blend it into the existing mud effects, making sure that the transition is smooth. Be patient with this section, as it can take a while to make sure that the final result is satisfactory. If I remember correctly, just this front section took me about 20 to 30 minutes to get right. Finally, we'll add some more dark mud with a speckling technique, which will allow for more random bits of wet mud that look like they were splashed up as the vehicle was driving around. For speckling, I tend to blend about 60% of the dots on the vehicle. Too many dots make the overall effect look less intentional and low effort. Yes, we are trying to recreate the random splashes that a tank would kick up, but we're also attempting to create an aesthetically pleasing final product. That's why I blend out things like tide marks and rough transitions, even though technically those things can happen in real life. Then, using the same process as I did with the drive sprocket, I added static grass around the drive sprocket on the hull and matted it down with AK Heavy Mud Dark Earth. I ended up removing a little bit of the static grass later as the effect was overpowering, but I'm still very happy with how that looks. I then added some dark mud to the rear plate and called it good. Now we can button up the running gear. I secured everything in place with extra thin super glue, as it won't really react with the paint job. Next up, let's tackle the side skirts. This process is going to basically involve speckling, then streaking, then more speckling, and more streaking, working through all of the colors and layers we want to implement. As usual, I started with dust, as it'll be the most prevalent and is the lightest color. As you can see, I'm speckling this onto the areas that I want to affect in semi-random passes, building up the layers. Now pretty much all the speckles are designed to just randomly deposit the dust effect onto the side skirts, and all of them are going to be blended into streaks. I like using a combination of flat, round, and pointed brushes to achieve my streaking, usually in a set of 3 processes. The first loosens the speckles from the surface with a heavier application of mineral spirits. The second shapes the streaks and removes some of the leftover mineral spirits. And finally, the third uses a totally dry brush to blend the streaks and incorporate them into the background. I'm also going to bias heavier deposits towards the bottom of the skirt, as the surface tension of the water will cause the dust to accumulate there. Now for darker dirt accumulations. For this, I'm going to use a thin mix of the same stuff we used for the running gear and lower hull. This time I didn't mix any dirt in, however, since I wasn't looking for a super heavily textured result. It's essentially the same process as before, but this time I really want to build up some heavy dirt accumulations, so you can see how I barely touch the bottom of the skirts, letting large deposits collect there. This technique can be a little frustrating at first because it takes a lot of passes to get it to where it looks streaky and accumulated and uniform as well. However, I think it looks really good when it's done, as you can see in a couple seconds here. Just be patient with it and keep working it until you have the result that you like. I like to have a slightly cleaner upper part of the skirt with a really heavily dirted up bottom part. If that's your style, then go for that. But if you don't like that, then don't do as much blending as I'm doing here. It's all up to you. After that, I'm going to add the wet mud with AK Dark Mud effects. For this one, I wanted a more precise application, so I applied it to the larger dirt deposits and along the underside of the side ERA plates, where I assumed water would splash up. We then will carefully blend this through. It can be a little difficult to avoid affecting the previous layers. I think next time I'm going to wet blend these instead of waiting for each layer to dry. Again, I added streaks with the wet stuff to add further tonal interest. To make sure that the road wheels matched, I also added some AK Dark Mud onto the previous effects. The surface looks a little bare, so I'm going to add some dark mud speckles onto the existing effects to add randomness to the surface and also homogenize the effects. Finally, last but not least, let's get the upper hull sorted. For this project, I don't really want to add a ton of dirt and debris to the upper surfaces since I really like the color variation that we added in the last video, and I didn't see a ton of stuff besides tarps and things on the upper surfaces in photo references. So, that being said, I'm going to do a simple dust patina on the upper surfaces using AK dark dirt deposits. I chose dark dirt deposits over light dust deposits because I felt like it matched the overall look of the vehicle anyways, and isn't as apparent as a lighter color. So, for application, I'm going to apply streaks along panel lines and different places that the dust may accumulate. Now I know that some of this is a little inaccurate to how it would appear in real life, but I'm also using this layer to add more unevenness, grime, and variation to the surface. After it's all applied, I'm going to use a brush with just barely any mineral spirits left on it, basically all unloaded off the brush at this point, to blend the dust and to give it a really smooth and diffuse appearance on the final result. Along with just a normal paintbrush, I used a cotton bud to really feather the edges and give it a smooth transition between the painted surface and the dusty areas. When examining where to place all the dust, think about where in real life it would accumulate. At the bottom of slopes, around recesses in panel lines, and along where the crew would walk, along with other things. Finally, to complete the mud, dust, and debris effects, we're going to add a little leaf litter on the upper surfaces, which I tacked down with thin matte varnish. I didn't want to overdo this effect, however, and I think next time I'm going to invest in a leaf punch to achieve more realistic looking leaves. Well, that's all I've got for you guys today. So sorry that this video took a while to get out. It's a lot of work working on such a large vehicle, and I didn't realize how much of an undertaking that was. Next week, or in 2 weeks from now, I should have the last video of the series out and posted for you all. After that, I have a few plans that my Patreon subscribers already know about over at Patreon. If you want exclusive content on a more regular basis, then consider becoming a member for $1 a month. I even post some free stuff sometimes. I'm really trying to grow this channel right now, so if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, and if you enjoyed the video, consider sharing it with your other modeling buddies. Anyways, till next time, I am the Scale Engineer, and thank you for watching.